Hi everyone, welcome to part 3 of our lecture on the industrial foundations in California. In this part of the lecture, we're going to talk about the migrant experience that you read about in chapter 10 and chapter 15. So now we're going to explore California post the Great Depression. And so California recovered more quickly than other parts of the country, and a large part of that was due to the federal government investing in California in terms of the military. And so we had a massive investment in the military. From 1941 to 1945, $70 billion alone in that period of time. During the ramp up of World War II. And that's when we get Camp Pendleton, which I'm sure that you guys are familiar with. Camp Pendleton is really massive and had a great effect on the geography of Southern California. If you think about kind of the development of the coastline, Camp Pendleton is really unique because that entire coastline would have been developed, and a lot of people say that San Diego County would have really been LA South, right? That development would have continued all the way down through. So it's during that time that we're getting massive military investment, bases being built, and shipyards, which you read about in Chapter 10, particularly the Richmond shipyard. And so what we see is a lot of migration from the southern United States, particularly of African Americans, coming to California in search of economic opportunities, again, due to this wartime investment in California, but also fleeing oppression and Jim Crow laws, heavy segregation in the South at the time. Schools were segregated, neighborhoods were segregated, drinking fountains were segregated, and so people were really looking for a better opportunity when they came from California. So not just about economics, but also fleeing that oppression and Jim Crow laws. And so those labor shortages, which we talked about a little bit before in the previous module, equal jobs. So jobs that had typically been prohibited, African Americans typically couldn't take, now are available to them because we need labor, and particularly women. So you read about the experiences of 4 women, women working in things like welding jobs in shipyards, which was definitely not available to them before. And we see something called chain migration, which has actually been in the news a lot lately as well. And so chain migration is this idea that basically you have kind of successive people migrating to a specific place from a specific area. So you read about the experiences of these women where one person would come out, typically a man first, and then send for the rest of the family in kind of successive waves, but not just the family, but then you wind up with other members of the community coming, people especially related through church. That chapter talked a lot about, but the center for a lot of these people was church and family. So these successive waves of people coming from the same place and really kind of forming these group of Southerners that were living in California at the time. When they came here, though, they still faced heavy discrimination. While California was not technically segregated at the time, there was certainly lots of racism and oppression for African Americans. And so, but they still had better economic opportunities than they had in the South. And so when we look at the Bay Area, then the San Francisco area, migrants were often unwelcomed. This is including by African Americans who were already well established in the area, because they were looking for more kind of social justice and economic justice. A lot of the people who were already living here were afraid to kind of rock the boat and saw kind of these people coming in as a threat, that they were going to face more oppression due to that. And then you wind up with this kind of de facto segregation. And so while we do not have a legal form of segregation in California, we get something called white flight. which is a phenomena that we have seen repeated over and over again in the United States, especially in Detroit, where you get African Americans moving into an area and then white people leaving that area, typically for suburbs. Then you also get housing discrimination practices where African Americans are kind of pigeonholed into these very distinct communities that are less desirable real estate. Um, and you're going to watch a very short video about Oakland and West Oakland in particular. And so you wind up with this de facto segregation. So your reading talked about one of these girls who, when she first moved here, her school was not majority African American, it was majority white, but as more African Americans moved in, white people left, and then by the time she graduated, her school was majority African American. And so generally speaking, when that happens, then a school is less well funded, and you wind up with a not as good education system. Despite the fact that these people came in for these jobs during World War II, after World War II, when people returned from the war, many of them were forced out of this workforce. So these jobs as welders and in shipyards were taken over then by returning whites, and they were forced out of this workforce, leading to high rates of unemployment or people going into much lower paying jobs. This also happened with women across the country after World War II who had, come into the workforce in droves to help out, but then were excluded after World War II. And so when we look at the Bay Area now, that second chapter talks about, different migration into the Bay Area. The Bay Area is, I will probably say, the most expensive housing market in the country, if not one of the most, but I'm pretty sure it might be the most at this point. And your textbook was written, I believe, in 2002, and this has only gotten considerably worse, where buying a home in the Bay Area now will cost you upwards of $1 million. So we had the tech boom in California and in the Bay Area, which led to these rising housing costs. You have people coming in who are making a lot of money and they need places to live. And so housing costs have gone up and up and up and up. And low-income residents are now being pushed out of these areas. And this includes historically black neighborhoods like West Oakland. And so we get this process of gentrification, which is a process by which middle-class people take up residence in traditionally working-class area of a city, changing the character of that area. You're going to watch about a 20-minute video on some of the gentrification that's happening in San Francisco right now, and how a lot of these neighborhoods are dramatically changing. When gentrification happens, right, when you have a neighborhood, it's often called urban revitalization, it really doesn't benefit the people who are already living there. Those people then are being forced out into more the peripheries of cities. So if you are a low-income resident of San Francisco and you are working in a job such as in a restaurant, or you are working in kind of more of these home-based occupations, you are going to have to travel farther and farther and farther to get to your job, simply because you can't afford to live near it, which is putting another economic strain on you and leading to kind of more unemployment, because it's just very hard to live anywhere near your job. And so we have the rise of Silicon Valley and the tech boom. Throughout the 80s and 90s, we had the tech bubble burst, but now is still growing quite rapidly. And so that other chapter that you read kind of talked about these different migrants that are coming in, but really there's a huge inequality there. We have two very different immigrant experiences. We have people that are coming in with very specialized skills that are on these HB1 visas, where they're being employed by these tech companies. And typically when you come in on this type of visa to work at these very specific jobs, Your spouses are not allowed to work, which presents its own unique set of problems. But you're basically coming in to work at this very specialized job and likely making a good income while you do it, as opposed to other immigrants who are possibly coming from places like Mexico who do not have these highly specialized skills, who are working in these very low paying jobs. You're going to read an article too about why Silicon Valley is so awful to women. Tech has a diversity problem, much like Hollywood does. And so a lot of these higher positions in these tech companies are not held by women and minorities. And despite the fact that it's this very liberal place that promotes these kind of very liberal ideas, there is still this very hard to penetrate glass ceiling for women and for people of color in Silicon Valley and the tech industry. And so your text briefly mentions this idea of the model minority. The model minority myth, and I'll call it a myth, is this idea that basically there are certain groups of minorities who are seen as not being kind of these victims of oppression, and that they kind of overcome it by being kind of model members of society. And really, different groups at different times in California have been given preference economically, not just for education experience, because those groups were perceived as less likely to unionize, and so they were given this kind of preference. And so we will talk about in the next module, we'll talk about Cesar Chavez and efforts by Mexicans to unionize. And while these strides are really great, they were also kind of led to this kind of corporate backlash, because you are going to get preferential treatment if you are kind of not going to be perceived to rock the boat. And despite the fact that many Asians and Asian Americans are working in the tech industry, in some places up to 50% of the employment is Asian and Asian Americans, they are still not holding, for the most part, management positions or high up positions, right? So there is still that glass ceiling for them as well. And so now you're going to watch a video about West Oakland, and you're going to watch a longer video about gentrification in the Bay Area, and how these immigrant communities, these kind of long-standing immigrant communities, are being affected by this tech boom in the Bay Area.